Spirit, by your power, may our words and our actions spread to those around us and share with them the life that we have been given. Amen. So in our readings this morning, we are back once again to talking about resurrection, or resurrections in this case. It makes sense. It hasn't been that long since Easter. It's been like a month. When obviously we talk about and read about and celebrate Jesus' resurrection. But these readings this morning are a good reminder and a good example of the fact that while Jesus' resurrection is, I think, clearly the most important, it is not the only one. That actually, if you look through the Bible, one of the themes you could easily find through the Old Testament as well as especially the New Testament, one of the themes you could easily find would be resurrection. You can find that theme repeated in many of the books contained here. You'd find it cropping up in surprising places. There might be stories of resurrections, people brought back from the dead that you'd forgotten or hadn't read before. Like maybe you've heard about Tabitha in the past, and maybe you haven't. Maybe this is the first time you've heard this story. And so resurrection is a theme and a repeated event in Scripture. For example, you have, back in the prophet Ezekiel, you may know the image of the Valley of Dry Bones, where Ezekiel has this vision of a valley of dead bodies that have dried up and have decomposed away and just left their bones there. And he sees this vision and he realizes that these dry bones are the people of Israel. And he has this vision and he asks God, can these bones live? And he's given a vision of all these bones knitting themselves back together, being clothed once again in flesh and coming back to life. Similarly, in the Gospels, we have the story of Lazarus, whose name is like synonymous with coming back from the dead. Who can remember anything else about Lazarus? Right? Maybe a few of us can. But that's the main thing. If I mention Lazarus, it's the first thing you're probably going to think of, is he is someone who came back from the dead, who was resurrected before Jesus was. And this morning we have the story of Tabitha, or Dorcas, Tabitha, I think. That's what Peter calls her. And she too is resurrected. And she is not the only resurrection story in the New Testament. This was one of the signs that the early church presented as justifying their beliefs. That not only was Jesus raised from the dead, but others could be raised from the dead as well. Like I said, it's a recurring theme that comes not just once, but again and again and again, culminating in our reading this morning from Revelation, where we have this multitude of people from every nation, every tribe, every people, every language, and they've all been resurrected, and they've been brought together and clothed in white, and they're before God's throne. So the culmination of Scripture is also resurrection. One of the ways we talk about Jesus, taking this from Scripture, is that Jesus is the firstborn among the dead. He's called that more than once in the New Testament. And it wouldn't make sense if you only have one child. Like I only have one child. It wouldn't make sense for me to call Poppy my firstborn, because you'd be expecting me to mention other children, right? Poppy is an only child, as of now, and so I wouldn't call her my firstborn. When you say firstborn, it strongly implies there are others coming. This is just the firstborn. And so we talk about Jesus as firstborn from the dead. He is emblematic, meaning he is the ultimate example of resurrection, but also that Jesus is the first of many. At the very least, many. At the very least, a multitude. Maybe even all. if God gets what God wants from the world. But there are still questions around resurrection as we find it presented. Like, some things are answered with the idea that other people are resurrected in Scripture and not just Jesus. He isn't the sole resurrection in Scripture. But other questions still remain, like why some people and not others, for example. So we have the story of Tabitha, a deacon, who was brought back from the dead. Surely she is not the only deacon who died. Absolutely, since then, she obviously isn't the only deacon who has died. And we're not presented with her as anything special in herself. Like, she made and donated clothing for widows and supported them. That was one of the things that deacons did. She provided leadership for her church. That's why her death is like a crisis. And people reach out and say, oh, Peter's nearby. We need help dealing with this. Peter, come to us quickly because you're in a neighboring city. But there's nothing about Tabitha that would make her stand out among other deacons. And so the question kind of remains, like, why Tabitha, not others? Why Lazarus and not other disciples? Why Lazarus and not John the Baptist, for example? That would have been a heck of a resurrection to pull off. And so when we look at resurrection, both in the text itself, and also when we read these stories as us in the here and now, and we think about them and we hear sermons about them maybe, is resurrection just reading about a past event, even from a reliable source, and thinking about that past event and considering what it means? Or is resurrection just a future hope? Probably a distant future hope at this point. Early in Christianity, there was this idea that, like, the end of history is coming really soon. Like Paul would say, don't even bother getting married, because this whole thing is being rebooted very shortly. And that was obviously not correct. Because here we are, 2,000 years later. So it may be 2,000 more years, who knows? But is resurrection only that? I don't think so. I think the resurrection is a pattern. It is a thing that happens continually, both in Scripture and also, I think, in our lives as well. This came up in pub theology the last time we met. As anyone who's sat in a room with me for some length of time knows, I go on tangents. And so I went on a tangent about Jesus' resurrection. A pretty, like a solid tangent for pub theology, but still, I'm not even sure how we got there. And so I was talking about Jesus' resurrection, and the image was like, if you could send someone back in time with a video camera, and they were there for the resurrection, like, what would that video camera record? Because the gospel stories of resurrection vary. They are not all identical. And the things that Jesus does after the resurrection also vary. Like, at one point, he eats a breakfast of fish. At one point, at 2 points at least, he enters a locked room filled with terrified people without using the door. He comes and he goes. He arrives next to you on the road and you don't recognize him. You see him in the cemetery and you think he's the gardener at first, even though you've been living with the guy for like 3 solid years. So, what does he look like? What is he doing? How does he relate to a living person? These are all questions I ultimately don't think are answerable. Because Avengers Endgame aside, time travel is not something that's going to happen. The movie features time travel. Because I just 80% blank looks. Back to the Future aside, time travel is not an option. And I don't know what that person would see if they went back with the camera. I genuinely do not know. They could see a number of different things and I wouldn't be shocked or surprised. So the first thing I think about when I think about Jesus' resurrection is I remember that we don't probably cannot know exactly what it was like. Exactly what happens. How does someone pass through a locked door, but also have a disciple poke into his wounds? Like, how does that work? How does he remain wounded but not still bleeding to death? I don't know. And I don't think it's knowable. It's interesting to talk about, but it isn't something we can settle down on and know for certain. However, the second important thing about the resurrection for me is that it was a genuine experience of the disciples. Like, it actually happened. It wasn't a trick. They didn't sneak in the night and roll the stone away, maybe using levers and fulcrums because it was super heavy, and steal Jesus' body and then lie about it. Or they didn't experience a simultaneous mass delusion and have like a psychotic break and all have the same hallucination. Like, whatever happened was genuine. And the reason we know this isn't because we can know the details of what happened. It's because we know some details of what happened after. And the disciples did not behave like people who were fraudulent or who were deluded. They behaved like people who were thoroughly convinced of the resurrection. Because most of them would be killed for believing in that resurrection. The disciples, for the most part, did not die of old age. They died of execution and persecution. And that is the behavior of people who are thoroughly convinced by a real event, not playing a trick, not just having a psychotic break. For me, the third important thing about resurrection is that it can happen to us as well. For me, if we're talking about a distant past event, or if we are only talking about a distant future event that maybe is symbolic, but doesn't have an effect on us here and now, then it is of less interest. Or if whatever it is that the disciples experienced could only be experienced by them, and would never be experienced by anyone ever again to come after them, that is also of less interest to me. So for me, it's important that it's a real thing, and that it's a real thing that can happen to us here and now. To me, resurrection is like a dandelion. It is meant to spread. You can look at Jesus' resurrection like the single yellow bloom of a dandelion, turning into a ball of seeds, and those seeds spread, and they carry with them resurrection all over the place. And then those seeds take root and more blooms come up, and then those become seeds and spread further. That's why I think resurrection occurs throughout Scripture. That's why I think it occurs to people like Tabitha, for example, or Lazarus, or in Ezekiel's visions, or others. When there is a new way of life that values widows and orphans and sojourners, or we would say migrants, that values those excluded people's lives and puts them at the center, I see that as resurrection. When the poor and the oppressed put their hope in a promise of a time when their tears will be dried and they will never shed another. When people who have come through great persecution and tribulation are clothed in white and rejoicing, for me, that is resurrection. Last week, when I talked about our lives not following plan A some of the time, when they fall apart, when our plans are upended, when we seem to experience utter failure, only to find that really there was just another plan. It wasn't our plan, it was better. And when we find a new life in following that plan, that to me is resurrection. Not just looking back to a singular event, not just looking ahead to a a promise at an unknown distance from us. But the idea that we are part of a great multitude, from different times and places, different nations, peoples, tribes, languages, that like Ezekiel's bones, like Lazarus, like Tabitha, like others, we too are being resurrected. But resurrection isn't a longing for a past or a future event. To me, the important thing about resurrection is that it is also here and now.